You're a Roman soldier on the Danube frontier. Just before sunrise, you hear it. A low, distant rumble that sounds like a storm on the horizon. You glance up. Clear sky, no clouds, no thunder. The sound grows. The ground starts to vibrate under your sandals. Your spear shakes in your hand. Then realization hits you like a fist. That isn't thunder. It's hooves. Thousands of them. You've heard the rumors. The veterans muttered them around campfires and then laughed them off in daylight. Tales about riders who live and die in the saddle. About warriors who drink blood straight from the necks of their enemies. About a warlord who eats from a rough wooden dish while the gold of entire cities melts in the fires behind him. You told yourself those were campfire stories. And then you see them crest the ridge. Small, wiry men on shaggy steppe horses. Skulls stretched into unnatural shapes from childhood bindings. Faces like something out of a nightmare. Bows already strung. Eyes flat, patient, predatory. At their center rides a man so plain you almost chuckle. Broad-chested, big head, narrow eyes, thin beard. He looks like any other steppe chieftain, until you see what's in his gaze. You are looking at Attila, and you have maybe 4 minutes left to live. In 452 AD, the city of Aquileia was one of the Western Empire's jewels, a rich commercial hub at the top of the Adriatic with stout walls, deep coffers and powerful friends. Its people believed stone and status would keep them safe. They were wrong. When Attila's army arrived, Aquileia held out for months. The defenders watched the Huns ride around their walls, burn their fields and drag off anyone caught outside. But inside, there was confidence. The walls were strong. Resupply might come. Rome had always come through before. And then one day, Attila was watching the city through that unreadable stare of his, when he noticed something. Storks abandoning their nests on the battlements, flying away with their young. To him, that was an omen. Even the birds know this place is finished. He ordered one last, all-out assault. The walls cracked, the Huns poured in, and then came the command that would turn Aquileia into a ghost. Don't just take it, erase it, not a simple sack. Systematic erasure. People killed or chained and dragged away. Buildings leveled, stones pried apart. Anything that would remind anyone a city had once stood here, destroyed. The work was so thorough that for centuries afterward, travelers could pass over the site and never realize they were walking over a dead city. The few who escaped fled into the marshes and shallow lagoons along the coast. Desperate to stay beyond the reach of horses, they drove wooden piles into the mud and built their homes on platforms above the water. That refugee camp on stilts would eventually grow into Venice. One of the world's most beautiful cities exists because people were so terrified of one man that they chose to build their lives in a swamp rather than risk meeting him again. This is how a living, breathing human being became, in his own lifetime, a symbol of the end of the world. How a steppe warlord earned a title Europeans would whisper for 1,000 years, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, and to understand how he did it, you have to follow him into some very dark places, into the things he actually did, and into the things people believed he could do. To grasp Attila, you first have to understand the world he collided with, and the world he came from. The year is 406 AD. On parchment, the Roman Empire still looks gigantic, a great blot of imperial purple, stretching from Britain to the deserts of Syria. From the Atlantic to the Black Sea, on the ground it's rotting. The Rhine frontier has split wide open. Germanic warbands are streaming into Gaul and Spain. Tax systems are breaking down. The currency is debased. Court politics in both halves of the empire are a snake pit of incompetence and intrigue. Emperors are puppets, generals are kingmakers, and far beyond the eastern horizon of any Roman map, past the Black Sea, past the last farming villages and border forts, a different power has been growing in the grasslands, the Huns. Roman writers had no real language for them. They weren't city dwellers, they weren't settled farmers, they were the nightmare opposite of everything Rome told itself it was, people who seemed to have no fixed home at all. Hunnic boys were put on horseback so young that by adulthood, some could barely walk any distance without discomfort. They ate, slept, hunted, negotiated, and fought in the saddle. Roman chroniclers describe a practice that horrified them, cranial deformation. Hunnic infants had their heads wrapped tightly, so that as the skull grew, it elongated. The result was a generation of adults with high, sloping, almost conical skulls. Combine that with scarred faces, furs, lamellar armor, and you have a visual effect no Roman legionary had been prepared for. In battle, it was like facing another species, and their way of war rewrote the rules. They used powerful composite bows, laminated from wood, horn, and sinew, capable of punching arrows through armor at ranges Roman infantry weren't trained to expect. They did not form neat battle lines and push. They flowed. Feigned retreats, sudden encirclements, hit-and-run harassment, tactics designed to shred rigid formations and nerve alike. Stories spread that they tenderized raw meat by wedging it under their saddles and eating it on the move, still warm. That they drank the blood of their horses and of their enemies to survive long campaigns. To Roman eyes, to a culture that valued stone, straight roads, and set-piece battles, the Huns weren't just another barbarian tribe. They were chaos given human shape. Attila was born into that world somewhere around 406 AD, probably in the Great Plains north of the Danube and Black Sea. We know almost nothing about his childhood. What we can be sure of is that he grew up in a confederation, not yet an empire. Hunnic power was spread across multiple tribal leaders and royal families, held together by shared campaigns and the threat they posed to settled peoples. In 434 AD, the leadership of this confederation passed jointly to two brothers, Attila and Bleda. For over a decade they co-ruled, negotiating with the Eastern Roman Empire, raiding its lands, and squeezing gold out of Constantinople at an ever-increasing rate. On paper, they were partners. In reality, one of them was already thinking past that arrangement. Around 445 AD, Bleda suddenly disappears from the record. No battlefield, no recorded illness. One year he is present at the head of the Hunnic host. The next, he is gone, and Attila is ruling alone. Ancient writers are tactful, modern historians are not. The simplest explanation is that Attila had his brother killed, we don't know how. Poison at a feast, a hunting accident, a group of loyal retainers with orders to make sure there were no witnesses. We will never know the details, and that may have been the point. Attila did not just remove his co-ruler, he removed the story of how it was done. All that remained was the effect. Every chieftain who heard that Bleda was dead and Attila was now sole king had to fill in the blanks themselves. He won't hesitate to do this to his own blood. What would he do to us? With that one move, Attila cleared the board. Then he started rebuilding it around himself. Attila's genius was not just military, it was psychological. He understood that you don't lead steppe warriors, fiercely independent men with their own followings and grudges, with titles alone. You lead them with presence. When the Roman ambassador Priscus visited Attila's camp in 448 AD, he left us a snapshot that tells you almost everything you need to know. Picture a great pavilion, rich with woven carpets and hangings, tables piled with meat, bread, wine. Around those tables sit Hunnic nobles and foreign guests, Gothic kings, Roman envoys, subject chieftains. They eat off plates of silver and gold. They drink from vessels studded with precious stones. They wear their finest tunics and cloaks, dripping in the portable wealth of the steppe. At the head of the table sits Attila. His clothes are clean but plain, no jewels, no embroidery. His cup and plate are made of wood. While everyone else laughs, exchanges toasts, and shows off, Attila is almost unnervingly still. He speaks rarely. He listens almost constantly. Priscus writes that nothing about Attila's appearance was striking, short, barrel-chested, with small eyes and a thin beard. But he and other visitors agree on one thing: the man's gaze could strip you. They talk about the way he watched people, as if weighing them, measuring their fears, their ambitions, their weak spots. They mention the feeling that he could see through them. That banquet was not modesty, it was theatre. Attila was silently reminding everyone in that tent that while they needed all that glitter to feel important, he did not. That he was the fixed point, and they were temporary. That he could give wealth, and just as easily take it away. The Romans had a system for dealing with dangerous neighbours. If fighting them would be ruinously expensive, they paid them. Tribute, subsidies, gifts, whatever you chose to call it. The idea was simple. Gold was cheaper than legions. Pay the barbarians to fight your enemies, not you. The Huns turned that system into a business. Again and again, Eastern Roman emperors agreed to treaties that guaranteed the Huns wagon loads of gold every year, in return for peace along the Danube. The sums were staggering, tens of thousands of pounds of gold over time, so much that some Hunnic nobles started buying Roman luxury goods by the cartload. As long as the gold train kept moving, Attila did not need to storm cities. He could lay siege to Constantinople's coffers instead. But in 441 AD, something slipped. The Eastern imperial government missed payments and played games with treaty terms. Whether through arrogance, cash shortage, or incompetence, they broke the pattern. Attila did not send a strongly worded letter. He rolled south. His army swept through the Balkans, hitting frontier fortresses and smaller cities first, then closing its hand around larger targets. Naissus, modern Nis in Serbia, was one of them. By the time Attila's men were done, Naissus was not merely conquered, it was uninhabitable. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts talk about corpses left to rot where they fell, wells fouled with bodies, buildings burned or torn down. Years later, when Priscus travelled through the ruins, he wrote that the stench still lingered, that bones still littered the banks of the river. Naissus was not alone. Town after town across the Balkans was looted, burned and abandoned. Some chronicles say more than 70 cities were destroyed or gutted. This was not random savagery. It was deliberate spectacle. Each annihilated city became a message to Constantinople. Your gold can buy peace, or it can buy the time it takes for us to ride from one ruin to the next. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II capitulated. In 443, he signed a treaty that tripled the annual payment to the Huns. He agreed to move Roman military posts farther back from the Danube, effectively turning swaths of imperial frontier into Hunnic pasture. There was even a clause about fugitives. If a Roman escaped into Hunnic territory, Rome had to pay a ransom to get them back. If a Hun fled into Roman territory, he had to be returned. No questions, no payment. On parchment, the empire that had dictated terms for centuries now looked like a supplicant. And Attila wasn't finished. In 447 AD he came again. This time his army pushed so deep into the Balkans that Hunnic riders reached the passes of Thermopylae, the same narrow gates where Leonidas and his 300 Spartans had once faced down another eastern invasion. For Christian Romans, that symbolism was brutal. Once, this had been the place where Greek spears stopped the east cold. Now, Hun cavalry were unchallenged on the plains beyond it. Once more, Constantinople had to buy him off, on even harsher terms. As city after city fell, as refugees flooded into urban centres, as bishops watched congregations slaughtered and churches burned, many Christians reached a conclusion that made a kind of awful sense. This wasn't just geopolitics. This was punishment. They began to speak of Attila not just as an enemy of Rome, but as an instrument of divine anger, God's whip. A scourge raised up to chastise a corrupt and sinful empire. They coined a Latin phrase, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. And here's a detail that matters, Attila liked it. He leaned into the title. Because if your enemies believe that resisting you is not just dangerous but blasphemous, if they think fighting you means fighting God's will, half your work is already done. Fear of you turns into fear of something bigger. Attila understood that better than anyone. By 450 AD, Attila had bled the Eastern Empire of so much gold that Constantinople was staggering. Its walls and fleet still made it hard to take by force, but its countryside had been devastated again and again. Time to look west. The pretext he found would sound absurd if it weren't so well recorded. Galla Placidia Honoria was the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, living a caged life in Ravenna. She was intelligent, headstrong, and fed up, caught in a sexual relationship with a court official, humiliated and forced into an arranged marriage with a dull but safe senator. She did something reckless. She smuggled out a plea for help to Attila, including, by all accounts, a ring. In her mind, this was likely a desperate request to a powerful outsider to intervene in her personal fate. In Attila's mind, it was something very different. He announced that Honoria had offered herself to him in marriage, and with her half the Western Empire as a dowry. Everyone knew this was fiction. That did not matter. Diplomatically, Attila now had a reason to demand lands and gold. When Valentinian refused to hand over his sister, Attila had his casus belli. In 451 AD, the Hunnic war machine rolled into Gaul. The scale of what followed is hard to overstate. Attila's multi-ethnic host, Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids and more, swept across the Rhine. Cities that had survived previous waves of invasion now met something new. Metz was reportedly taken and largely destroyed, some sources claiming it was burned on Easter Sunday. Reims, Strasbourg and other towns felt the weight of Hunnic fire and steel. The Western Empire had one real card left to play, a general named Flavius Aetius. Aetius had spent part of his youth as a hostage at the Hunnic court. He spoke their language, he understood how they thought, he had even used Hunnic mercenaries. His earlier civil wars. Now he turned that knowledge against them. He hammered out an alliance with the Visigoths under their king Theodoric I. Old enemies of Rome agreed, for once, that there was a greater danger. The two forces met Attila on the Catalonian plains in northeastern Gaul. Ancient authors describe a slaughter so intense that later generations inflated the numbers to mythical levels, hundreds of thousands dead. Modern estimates are more conservative but still point to casualties on a staggering scale for the time. Theodoric of the Visigoths died in the fighting, reportedly trampled by horses. But his people held their ground. The Romans and their allies managed to stop Attila from cutting the coalition in two. By nightfall, both armies were mauled. Attila withdrew behind a wagon fort, expecting a final desperate assault the next day. According to some later accounts, he prepared a pyre of saddles, vowing to throw himself into the flames rather than be captured. That attack never came. Aetius, wary of overextending and perhaps thinking in terms of long-term balance of power, chose not to press the siege to the bitter end. A totally shattered Hunnic confederation might leave the Visigoths as Rome's next unstoppable problem. So Attila lived. His core forces remained intact. He could frame this not as a crushing defeat but as a checked advance. Still, something important had changed. The man who had never lost in the field had been forced to back away. The invisible armor of invincibility around his name was cracked. A wounded predator is often most dangerous. In 452 AD, Attila turned his fury south into Italy. He crossed the Julian Alps, spilled into the Po Valley, and laid siege to Aquileia. You already know how that ended. From there he ranged through northern Italy like a scythe. Padua fell, Verona fell, Milan fell. Towns were looted, food stores emptied, people enslaved or killed. Smoke columns dotted the northern horizon. In Ravenna, and then in Rome, panic tightened its grip. The Western field army was a shadow of what it had once been. Most of the empire's remaining strength was either tied down elsewhere or already shattered. Valentinian III abandoned his capital and fled to Rome. The Senate met and looked the facts in the face. They had no army capable of stopping Attila at the gates. Imagine being an ordinary Roman in that summer. You've grown up on stories of Roman supremacy, of invincible legions, of an empire protected by God. And now, reports arrive daily of a man from the far steppe burning your cities, tearing down your walls, and scattering your countrymen. Whispers swamp the streets. He'll do to Rome what he did to Aquileia. He'll level it, turn the eternal city into a nameless field of bones. With no military option left, the Senate did the only thing they could. They sent a delegation, not led by a general, not by a master of horse or an imperial cousin. They sent a bishop, Leo, the Bishop of Rome, later known as Pope Leo the Great. Somewhere in northern Italy, near the river Mincio, the two men met. On one side, an aging cleric in simple robes, carrying nothing but his office and his faith. On the other, the Scourge of God, surrounded by armed horsemen and the smoke of his own triumphs. We have no transcript. No scribe sat nearby taking notes. Later Christian writers filled in the silence with miracle. They claimed that as Leo spoke, Attila saw figures, St. Peter and St. Paul, standing behind the bishop, swords drawn, threatening him with divine punishment if he marched on Rome. Terrified, Attila turned back. It's a powerful story, but it tells you more about how Christians wanted to see the world than about what actually happened. Here's what we can say with some confidence. By this point, Attila's army was in serious logistical trouble. Northern Italy had been ravaged by war and a poor harvest. Food was scarce. Disease, probably malaria and dysentery, was eating into his ranks. Horses were dying. Men were weakened. At the same time, news reached him that the Eastern Roman Empire, no longer under his boot, had crossed the Danube and was attacking Hunnic-controlled lands. His own base was under pressure, so Leo likely arrived to find a commander already calculating his exit. The bishop offered something Attila valued: money, recognition, and a dignified way to withdraw. "Leave Italy. Rome will pay you to do so. Go back and secure your heartlands." For a leader like Attila, who always balanced risk and reward, it was a rational choice. Why did he not simply take Rome as one last prize? Perhaps he judged that a sack of Rome wasn't worth the cost of a decaying army and a burning homeland. Perhaps he understood that wiping Rome off the map risked uniting his enemies in a single holy cause. Or perhaps, having already frightened the city into sending its highest religious authority to grovel before him, he decided fear was worth more than rubble. Whatever the mixture of motives, the result was this: Attila turned his horse north and rode away. To Romans, it looked like a miracle. To Attila, it was most likely strategy. Either way, the effect was the same. Even when he spared a city, it was in a way that made him seem larger than life. Attila had one more year. In 453 AD, in his mid-40s, he celebrated yet another politically useful marriage, this time to a young woman named Ildiko, probably of Germanic origin. The wedding feast was lavish: meat, wine, music, celebration. Attila, according to the story, drank heavily late into the night. Eventually he retired with his new bride. At dawn he did no. Tea emerged. Servants knocked. No answer. They called his name. Silence. Finally they forced the door. Inside they found Ildiko terrified, and Attila lying on his back, dead, his face and bed soaked in blood. The official explanation given by the Gothic historian Jordanes is bizarrely mundane: a severe nosebleed. Attila, he says, suffered a massive hemorrhage during the night. Drunk, perhaps lying in a position that blocked the flow, he inhaled and choked to death on his own blood. For a man whose public life had been one long legend, it's a shockingly anticlimactic end. Naturally, rumours of murder sprang up almost immediately. Did Ildiko stab him and escape notice? Was she planted by enemies, Roman or otherwise, with orders to remove him? Did someone slip poison into his cup? We have no proof for any of those scenarios. We do know what happened next. Attila's followers went mad with grief. According to Jordanes, they cut their own cheeks with swords, so that the greatest of warriors might be mourned not with the tears of women, but with the blood of men. They held a great funeral feast, Strava, where they alternated between mourning and recounting his victories. Then came the burial. Legend says his body was placed in a set of 3 coffins, one of iron, one of silver, one of gold, symbolizing war, tribute, and plunder. The grave was dug in secret, possibly in a riverbed temporarily diverted for the purpose. Once the water was allowed to flow back, no trace would remain. To guarantee that secrecy, the story goes, all the slaves who helped dig the grave were killed. To this day, archaeologists and treasure hunters have searched for Attila's tomb. They have found nothing. With Attila went the empire he had welded together. His sons, Elac, Dengizic, Ernak, tried to carve the realm into separate kingdoms. It was a fatal mistake. The Hunnic Confederation had always been less a state than a tornado held together by one man's will and the pressure of expansion. With that pressure gone, subject peoples saw their chance. Goths, Gepids and others rose in revolt. At the Battle of Nedo in 454 AD, Germanic forces smashed the Huns. Elac died in the fighting. Within a few years, Hunnic power in Central Europe had evaporated. The shockwave they had created went on without them. Some Huns were absorbed into steppe tribes farther east. Some served as mercenaries in other people's wars. As a coherent empire, they vanished, but the damage they had done did not. The Western Roman Empire was already crumbling from within before Attila, but he hit it like a hammer. Every city he looted was one less tax base. Every region he devastated was one more zone Rome had to try to rebuild or abandon. Every wagon of gold that rolled out of imperial treasuries to his camps weakened the state's ability to pay its own troops. Refugees dislodged by Hunnic raids pushed into other territories, setting off chain reactions of migration and conflict. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians. Everyone was jostling for space in a crumbling order. In 476 AD, just 23 years after Attila's death, the Western Empire formally collapsed. The last emperor in Italy was deposed. A line that stretched back to Augustus ended. Was Attila the cause? No. Was he an accelerant? Absolutely. Attila's real innovation was not a new kind of sword or bow. It wasn't even a new style of cavalry tactics. It was the industrial-scale use of reputation as a weapon. He understood that what people thought he was capable of could paralyze them as effectively as anything he actually did. If you believe your city is already doomed, you might not even try to defend it. If you think your enemy is literally God's punishment, resistance feels not just dangerous but sacrilegious. If tales of annihilated towns and unburied bones circulate for years, half his work in the next campaign is already done before a single horse trots across your border. Attila crafted that effect deliberately. The alien skulls, the raw meat stories, the wooden cup at the Golden Feast, the total erasure of places like Naissus and Aquileia. Each piece fed the legend. So did the name, the Scourge of God. 15 centuries later, his name still does what he wanted it to do. When we want to evoke ruthless destruction, we call someone an Attila. Medieval monks wrote of him as if he were a biblical plague. 19th century painters portrayed him as apocalypse on horseback. Even people who barely remember the details of his story know the name and the feeling it carries. The man is long gone, his empire dissolved, but the fear he cultivated, the awareness of how fragile apparently solid things really are, that lingers. It lingers every time we realize that cities we take for granted could vanish, that systems we assume are permanent can buckle in a season, that it doesn't take a demigod or a supervillain to shake an era, just one human being in the right place, with enough will and enough ruthlessness. So as you think back to that Roman, on the frontier, hearing the hoofbeats before seeing the riders, remember this: civilizations fall faster than they rise, maps lie, and sometimes the most terrifying part of a story isn't that it happened once, it's that it could happen again. If you want more deep dives into the people and systems that push the world to the edge, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story goes even darker, into the Mongol punishments that made even Attila's methods look almost restrained.